Well, as you can see, we're in San Francisco right now, but I wanted to say a little something about the place we stayed in Oakland last week, because I think that there was a number of interesting philosophical and aesthetic points to make about this charming little apartment. And little it was. This place was tiny. It was dinky. It was a teeny little place. But the thing about it was, it had an aesthetic sense of expression, a sense of irony, a sense of nuance, a sense of play in the way that the whole place was put together that really is worth talking about. The place that we stayed belonged to a woman named Kate Hill, cheesemonger, wine enthusiast, lover of cats, and apparently curator of very nice dinky little apartments with all sorts of sensibilities to them. The thing about this apartment was that it had all sorts of delightful and absurd tchotchkes, knickknacks, posters, pieces of art that were arranged around in reference to each other, juxtaposed to each other, in these delightful and absurd ways. And these weren't even just pieces of art. There were, of course, the knickknacks, these little pieces, but there was also ordinary things, wine corks, bottle openers, cigarette lighters, all sorts of things like this that were worked around with one another. And the thing is, the way that they were placed, the way that they were set within this little space, allowed them to make quips, to make remarks, even to make insights, often ironic and almost always humorous, about the things that Kate, the person who lives in this apartment usually, loves, right? She was able to say things about them. She was able to work them through in different ways. She was able, in other words, to play with both the objects and the space that the objects occupied in a way that allowed them to express and to say things about her, to be things about her, to express a sense of possibility, of aesthetic sensibility, of imagination, of all of these different things. There was a deep, I'd say, sensitivity, and really I think I'd probably use intelligence to the way that the apartment was arranged, to the way that the objects stood on their own, the way they represented things, the way they stood in relation to each other, and what they meant in Kate's life and Kate's imagination just by being what they are. Now this in itself is, I think, just a nice thing, but it got me to thinking also about another person who died over 200 years ago, a guy named Friedrich Schiller. Friedrich Schiller was a luminary of the German Enlightenment. He was a philosopher, he was a playwright, he might have been one of the greatest playwrights in the history of the German language. He's a poet, fascinating, interesting guy. And one of the things that Schiller talked about was the centrality of the idea of play in not just aesthetic experience, but in human experience generally. Here's what he said. He said, human beings have this situation where we're kind of stuck between two extremes when we try to understand and act in the world. On one side, he said, we've got this rational dimension, this part of us that tries to think, to figure, to measure, to find the forms of things, to account for things, to give rational and analytical accounts of why things are the way they are. Gives a great deal of clarity, helps us know exactly what's what and what's why, gives us cause and effect, all sorts of things like that. But there isn't any meaning in it. There isn't any sense in it. There isn't any worthwhileness in it in and of itself, except for perhaps the austere beauty of something like mathematics generally. Anyways, there's this one side to it. The other side, he said, was the sensuous side. And by sensuous, he means the aspect of us that encounters the physical world through the senses. So this isn't just ooh-ah senses, although I suppose there's a little of that. But the part of us that sees, tastes, touches, hears, smells. The part of us that goes out to the world, encounters it, touches it, as it were, with our senses, and knows it in that way. Now these are both ways of understanding the world, of encountering the reality of the world, and, for Schiller, beginning to bring ourselves about, being able to organize and act, being able to imagine what fundamentally we are in relation to it, right? That's what it is. But in and of themselves, they both have limits. And while we can try to combine the two, if we combine them, we have to find some way in which one doesn't dominate the other, in which we can get the two sides of our mental experience, the rational and the sensuous, to synthesize. But where? How? Where does that come in? How do we synthesize these things? And he said, well, the way that we do it, the great human achievement of this is in a synthesis in imagination in the form of play. Because here's what we do when we play with things. When we play with things, what we do is we take the rational dimension of something, so what we know it to be, what its nature is, what we understand it. We take its sensuous dimensions, the way we feel it, taste it, touch it, smell it, imagine it, remember it, anticipate it, whatever it is, right, through our senses. And we begin to move them around in absurd and fanciful ways. We get the different dimensions and possibilities to twist upon themselves into situations that might be strange or even impossible or reveal things that we wouldn't have otherwise recognized in them. When we play with things in our imagination, what we do is we take those objects and twist them around, not to warp them, but to see all of the new possibilities in them, and from that, find a way in which we can engage them, aesthetically appreciate them, and be in the presence of the world with them. It's a way of coming to find our freedom, right? To play with these ideas. The reason I bring all this up, and I'm talking about Schiller in relation to the cheesemonger, wine enthusiast, cat lover, and curator of apartments, Kate Hill, is because what Kate did with her apartment is she made it a space fundamentally of play, of aesthetic play. A place that is small, that would seem like, just almost cramped and uncomfortable, but she made that space through her imagination, through the way she twists and plays with the objects in it, through the way she even lets light come into it. She curated this apartment into a work of art itself, into a work of imagination, into a space of play, and a space that, ironically, as tiny as it is, I'd say you can find a little sense of freedom.